Hello everyone, I'm here with Eric Simonson, who is the Director of Supply Chain Management Solution at SAP, and he's been with SAP for longer than many of you have been alive, almost 18 years now.
That's right.
And have seen almost every side of SAP, where he is currently solution owner for the integrated business planning side of things. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this, but what I really wanted to do is have a conversation with Eric, just talk about ERP in general, because we've taught you some of the basic functionality, but I wanted to flesh it out a little bit with an expert so you just don't listen to me all the time. So Eric, in a few words, what do you think are the biggest benefits of implementing a core of the ERP, the core piece of it?
Okay, good question. We get this a lot of times, and first I think the best thing to do is define what we consider ERP, right? So ERP, and SAP's product now is called S/4HANA. It's the basis, it's the foundation of the house, right? So this is where we have functionalities such as like production planning, we have HR components, financial components. This is the basis for a lot of back-end office type functionality that many customers run. So this is the main guts of what happens. It's very integrated. So for example, I specialize in the production planning area. So a lot of times when you're doing a production run or a goods movement, an inventory creation, you need to have the financial accounting aspects behind that too. So they need to be in place in order for us to do our job on the manufacturing floor to make something and account for it.
That makes sense. Now, you mentioned the SAP HANA, and that's a new version. And that replaced, what did it replace?
Yeah, great question. So we had, a lot of people know, we had core ECC, and it used to be called R3. Back before that, it was even R2.
Okay.
So now we've moved to S4, and S4 HANA is both a cloud or on-premise deployed ERP solution that's built on our HANA technology.
And how does HANA stand for something?
Yeah, so HANA there's a lot of acronyms for it. A lot of people think it's Hasso-Plattner's analytical solution. I've heard various things. It started off as an analytics, but it's really kind of threefold. One, it does analytics that are embedded within the solution.
Okay.
It's a technology in terms of a programming capabilities within it. And then also it's our core database. Okay. So it is the database where data is stored. It uses column structures and such to be able to ascertain data quickly.
So I assume it uses a relational database of some sort underneath everything?
That's
right. One of the things that we teach the students is the basics of it. We don't go into the great depth of what SAP, because that's a massive database. But is it safe to say that this core, HANA, has to be installed before you do any of the other modules?
Yeah, so the modules are just functionality that's enabled and part of that. So you could get the whole platform, but we license or we go to market with each of the different components. So for example, you could have a PP component of it, or materials management, or inventory management, or an HR aspect of it. You don't have to buy every one of them, but we're willing to sell you all of them.
But that's very nice of you. But if someone wants to use, you work in the supply chain management side of it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if someone wanted to implement that, they would have to put in at least part of that core.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so we have applications that kind of sit on top of the core. We call it the digital core, or S/4HANA. One of the areas that I focused in, as you mentioned before, was IBP. So that's something that can sit on top of, and it integrates and gets data from S4. It does it pretty seamlessly. We have pre-built integration techniques. We are agnostic, though. We can take data from other ERP systems if needed, but of course ours works out of the box a lot.
Yours is better, right?
It's tightly integrated, yes.
So is it is it a longer implementation time if you're hooking up to, say, an Oracle system or some other system?
It can be done. It's usually typically longer because you have to write those integration routines. Out of the box, we have some different integration techniques that are pre-delivered and predefined to say master data or transactional data in the ERP system equals this in our planning system.
Got it. So you mentioned the IBP, Integrated Business Planning Solutions. Tell us more about that, because I think that really encapsulates most of what we've talked about in this class, in these series of courses about supply chain management.
Perfect. So this is my area of expertise
go crazy.
and where I live most of my days. So we at SAP define supply chain planning as a few things. Really, IBP is made up of 5 components, although they all work together. I'll use the term component just to talk about them. So first we have is sales and operations planning. That's kind of the overarching wrapper, if you will, of the whole business process. Underneath there, we have IBP for demand, which is your statistical forecasting. We also have short-term demand sensing capabilities within that tool, but its goal is to determine a forecast about how much you're going to sell for what products where.
Okay, it can go down to the SKU level.
It goes down to the
So
SKU
you can
level.
set that aggregation, I assume?
Absolutely right. You can slice and dice it, so you could forecast at a top level, you could forecast at a low level, forecast in the mid. We have aggregation and disaggregation, so it's consistent through whatever level you want to look at the data.
Okay.
Exactly.
So you got the S&OP, the demand
piece,
planning.
right? And then we have an inventory piece, which is called IBP for inventory, which helps you determine to make sure that you have the right amount of the right product at the right place at the right time. So this helps set with your safety stock level and your target stocks. So this is incorporated both into the S&OP process at a higher level, more strategic duration or time horizon, but it's also a really key input to the supply planning piece, which is the next piece that I want to talk about.
So that sets the inventory levels. So I assume you are able to pick the way you want to set the safety stock. You can decide whether the level of service you want to hit for different parts.
Exactly.
So this is everything that we cover in SC1X. The demand planning we covered in SC1X, and the S&OP we covered in SC2X. So hopefully you guys see how everything we taught fits into this larger structure. Okay, and then so you've got the demand and inventory, and then the last piece?
Then we have two other pieces.
Oh.
We have response and supply, which is the supply side of things. So that's really two parts of the equation. We have a tactical planning, which is a little bit further out on the time horizon. People call that master production schedule or rough cut capacity plan.
How far out do you think?
Typically, customers plan out to 2 years on the supply side. It varies by customer and by industry, of course, depending on your lead times and your raw materials and such that have to be covered for. But typically, people plan out that far for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that they understand what their purchasing requirements are. And they can aggregate those and get better purchasing deals. Secondly is that they want to make sure that they have the capacity for those out into the future. If their business is expanding, do they need to open up new resources at a certain facility? Do they need to move different production capabilities from one location to another, etc.? So that's the tactical piece of it. Then we have the operational piece of this, and we call this kind of the response piece, if you will. And this is where we're doing closer to today, like 0 to maybe 2 months. Again, varies by customer and by industry, but we're determining that plan that we're going to pass over to the ERP system for them to execute.
Right, because the ERP, that core, that S4HANA, is really the execution side of things.
Execution. That is on the shop floor. They're going to make it. It's going to go on line 1, and they're going to do goods confirmation. Things are rolling off the lines. We're sticking tags on it, barcode and QR, RFID, etc. But in our world of planning, we still plan from today to 2 months as an example.
Right.
Some of that's dealing with live customer orders that are coming in. Oh, we just had a big customer order happen. What does this mean? Should we bump out something? Should this take precedence? What can we do to juggle this to make sure that it's satisfied because it's a high priority customer? And then of course the distribution/deployment side of it. Right. So the plant gets done making it. Do we sell it out of the plant? If so, great. If not, where do we distribute it to? Does it go to DC1, DC2? And why is it going to those DCs? To satisfy sales orders or safety stock that was set during the inventory process?
And I assume a lot of that is very parameterized. So if you want to have a 12-week production planning versus 24-week or anything in that, and you can change the way in which you want to interact between the tactical and the operational plan.
Absolutely right. Those horizons can vary. We're not cast in stone, and they can actually change for different product locations. It doesn't have to be just by one company or even one location. You could say these products within the location have a very short operational time. These other ones have a longer time.
So this is one of the questions I have. So it sounds like it's very parameterized. You can make it do almost anything you want, but as you know, when you do that, the complexity goes up. So how do you protect the customers from themselves when they implement something? Because in planning, it's like, oh, I want to do all these different things, but then it comes very hard to set it up, to maintain, and those things. How do you draw that balance?
I say the same thing that you just said, actually. I always say, with flexibility comes complexity, right? So we have a slogan at SAP called Run Simple. It's a nice marketing pitch, right? And we get it across, but at the end of the day, you have to be flexible in terms of what customer needs are.
Right.
So as a consultant, what we typically do in our implementations is we start small. So what I mean by that is we don't want to try to boil the ocean in one implementation or one phase of an implementation, right? We say, okay, what is our scope? What is our focus? Let's accomplish these few things and then build upon that. Right? So we try to start simple, solve the big problems first, and then move on to the next ones. And you see that typically a lot of phased implementation.
Do you do that phased in terms of functionality or in terms of regions
Yeah.
or SKU lines? Because you can increase your scope in many ways. What have you seen and what do you prefer?
That's a great question. So I've seen it both ways.
It's the only kind of questions I ask here.
It was a great question because I've seen it both ways. We do it in terms of functionality. A lot of times people start at the higher level,
Right.
meaning S&OP, then demand, then inventory. My section, so the supply or even the production planning, I always seem to be the tail of the dog.
Okay.
At the bottom of the equation, right? Everybody else gets to go before me, and maybe they figure it out, flush out all the problems, then I go. So we've seen that, but I've also seen what we call a big bang approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do it all together. We say, okay, we're going to have a demand part of the project, a supply, a scheduling, etc. And maybe typically their big bang are done regionally, right?
Okay.
So it might be Latin America, then we move to Europe, Asia, etc.
So there have to be pros and cons of each approach. Which do you tend to prefer, the big bang or the, what did you call it, the gradual?
The phase, yeah,
the phase or the spiral.
Yeah,
do something
typically I
simple.
like the phased approach because I think from a business process standpoint, it makes better sense to kind of flush out some of those issues and work through those and refine those processes before you move on to the next
Because they
step.
influence
Absolutely
how you do it.
right.
That makes sense.
If you can dial in your forecasting, that's going to solve a lot of the downstream
Right.
situations.
So you mentioned the tactical and operational sides. It sounds like that's where optimization or heuristics would live. A lot of the decision support systems. Because one of the beautiful things about optimization, it gives you an optimal solution. One of the challenges is it can be sometimes hard to explain.
Figuring
so
out
can you
what-
give that anecdote that you
Sure.
provided?
It's a true story. I'll preface it that way. So just a quick background here. From a heuristics perspective, we're talking about an unconstrained plan, which is not capacity constrained or material constrained. It's like MRP. It just gives you what you need. You say, I need 1,000. It'll tell you you're going to get 1,000. Optimization, just to, again, put it in reference point here, is going to figure out, it looks at it holistically and determine, why it should do something. Maybe it's better to do something at another location that's a little bit more not cost effective because another product can only be made at a place that is more cost effective for
Right.
A. So it looks at all of that and figures it out. So the tough part is us as human beings and able to do that. So my quick story was we did a presentation as a pre-sales engagement for our customer on the West Coast, and they were using a kind of a heuristics approach, and we modeled that, but some of their requirements led to optimization. They had some needs for resource capacity, min utilization, because they had
Right.
a lot of contract manufacturers, and they would get these big penalties if they didn't make a minimum amount at all
Sure.
the manufacturers.
Which is hard to take care of in a heuristic.
Exactly. It doesn't force it to do that. So
Right.
we could use cost parameters and such to force the equation to do that. So we provided that solution to them, and it was a good fit. But one of their planners made a question about, well, how do I know what it did and why it did it? And sometimes it looks like it's coming from one location. We don't typically do that, and I would do it this way. And there was some IT folks in the room, and I tried to, kind of soften that answer, if you will. And at one point, he cut me off and said, well, you just have to have some faith.
You just got to believe the optimization.
You got to believe in it. And the real answer to that, in a nutshell, I could talk about it for hours, but the real nutshell is, or the real answer is that you have some pulleys and levers
Right.
via cost parameters and prioritization techniques in the optimizer programming to be able to kind of force it down a path
Right.
to which you want to achieve that objective. And it will do that within those parameters, but you don't always understand exactly why it did it.
And the other thing, and we try to make this point, especially in SE0X and SE2X, when we do network design and do optimization, is that optimization will do anything to save a penny. And sometimes it'll do really stupid things to save a penny. And then also, it's harder to understand why things were made than it is to solve the problem sometimes.
I would
so
agree.
it's a double-edged sword there.
I would agree with that. And sometimes we get asked that question. Lots of times we might have a cost setting that's 1 cent on one place and 2 cents on another. And it'll take the inventory and
Right.
throw it all to the one that's 1 cent, everything that's left over after it met the demand. And some people will say, well, I'd still like to have some over here.
Yeah.
And then you set them both at one, and then it doesn't know that there's one better or worse than the other one for
Right.
excess. It doesn't think it's any better or worse. So we have some unique coding challenges in that regards and some off-base solutions that can help that.
Models don't make decisions, people do, right? It's a decision support. And so it'll always need someone to interpret those results.
Exactly.
So you've been doing this for 18 years with SAP. So you've seen a massive change. So what are some of the big changes you've seen in the way that SAP was implemented and used in 2006? No, 1996.
1999 is when I joined, yeah.
To now. What are the big changes that you've seen?
Yeah, so I guess I would say back in the early 2000s, we'll start there. You know, it was very core fundamental processes. A lot of people coming from spreadsheets. You know, the maturity curve or the evolution of planning was very, very basic. Right?
So you're mainly replacing spreadsheets.
We're replacing spreadsheets.
That's such a scary thing.
Yeah, this is like we always joke about it. Our biggest competitor is Excel.
Yes.
Right. So, in some regards, wait until I get to the end of the story. You'll see how we've almost come full circle, but a little bit better. So that was one of the challenges, right? So as people started to evolve in that and they saw the real functionality with optimization techniques and prioritization algorithms that provide better answers, we've seen that happen, and most of our solutions were on-premise.
Okay.
So now we move in, you mentioned before, IBP. This is our next generation of supply chain planning solutions. Okay. That's kind of what we've codenamed it internally when we started this process back late in 2013. So we released that first product in 2014 under the IBP moniker, and we've been adding functionality and releasing other components of it since. It is a cloud-based only solution.
Can you just make sure, we've talked about, but in your words, what is the difference between cloud versus other ways that software has been delivered?
Okay, great. So on-premise, we really have two types of deployments. So a customer would have an IT department themselves. They would have their own server, their own IT staff. They would have to install, manage, monitor that solution. When it's on cloud, it's a subscription service, and we host those IT requirements.
Okay.
We're responsible for upgrading the solution. We're responsible for maintaining it. There's SLAs, service level agreements that make sure that there's no downtime or a certain percentage of it. And they relinquish that control from that perspective. So their planners come in and they can just log in. They don't know whether that server is, you know, somewhere in our data center or it's on their premise.
Right, and they shouldn't care.
They shouldn't care. Exactly, that's the point. We get asked that sometimes because when it was an on-premise, it was always like, what database are you running on? What kernel do you have? Very technical things. And when it's a subscription-based cloud service, we get asked, well, is this a HANA database and what's behind the scenes? And honestly, the answer should be, what difference does it make?
Right.
You're logging in. Does the functionality work? Does it perform the way that you want it to perform in terms of speed and functionally? And are you happy with the ability to do your job?
Now, that changes so many different things, because when you were selling a product, revenue recognition is very different. And so revenue recognition, if you guys haven't done software, you don't get all your revenue when you sell it. It has to be installed and it has certain things. And that's if you buy the product. Now it's a little bit different because you buy it by the SIP. I assume you have many different ways of doing that, but how has that changed the relationship from going from selling a product to almost a service?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think from a supply chain planning perspective, we're still learning through that. But it is a different relationship, because before, back in the late 90s, we would actually cut the CD, right? Back in the day, I sat next to the basis developer, and we
might need to explain to some of the students what a CD is. We won't even go to floppies.
Yes, round, thin disc that you used to be able to put music on.
Yeah.
But we used to put the software on it, and it would take, no lie, sometimes depending on the application, 20 CDs to install the software. Then you had downloads, but that was all on premise. Now we take care of that and it's there. So sometimes we'd sell it from an on-premise perspective and it was kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
You got it, you did what you want with it. It's kind of like buying a car and you bought it from me and you can drive it around. I don't know where you went.
You can modify it, you can do what you want.
Put on tinted windows and those, nice,
the
mud
curb
runners.
feelers and all that good
the
stuff.
whole thing, trick it out. And I don't know what you did with it, but when it's a leased car, right? I expect it to be
you tend not to do that. Yes,
maintained a certain way and has certain updates and periodic checks, and we do all of that.
So that might make it easier to do an upgrade then.
So we do have separate instances by customers, even though they're cloud. It's not a multi-tenancy, which means that we don't have 7 people running on one box. And when we press the upgrade button, all 7 get upgraded.
Okay.
There's 7 separate boxes. Data secure. There's a whole security thing that I wouldn't get into now and wouldn't do it its justice. But key takeaway is that we do have upgrades on a regular basis. And an important point before I talk about how that process happens is the frequency.
Okay.
So typically on an on-premise solution, the most frequent we would be doing an upgrade or a new version would be once a year. Sometimes it was 18 months. Sometimes it was 2 years.
Sure.
But 1 month was about as fast. We're releasing new versions of our integrated business planning solution once a quarter.
Wow.
So all that functionality comes out a lot faster. And then when we work with customers about that upgrade process, we don't just, on a Friday they go home and on Monday they come back and all of a sudden the thing looks different.
Right.
We give them, a heads up, we give them warning, we do it in a test environment. They can do some regression testing. pound the keyboard, see if there's any blatant issues, and before we go ahead and then do the upgrade to the production box.
Because it used to be, when I was in software, customers didn't want upgrades any faster than a year and a half because it took 6 months to do all of that. But it seems what's interesting is software is following the same path as almost music. Music went from you own the CDs to you buy the downloads to now you stream it. And so what you're seeing is the artists are now releasing, they used to release albums once every year, every 2 years. Now they're releasing songs almost every month, every week. And it seems the same thing that you can do it now. And it's much easier to do as you move from a product to a service.
I would agree with that. I was going to use the analogy of like my phone, right?
Oh, okay.
So, my apps are updating on a pretty regular basis, and it was funny just recently over the holiday break. I was on vacation and I pressed the App Store and I didn't have any updates, and first thing I said to myself is, the developers are on break too. Right? They're on holiday somewhere enjoying their time off. And I came back, and first week in January, hit update, 17 updates. They all came back, right? So we're not as bad as that, but we do it on a regular, periodic basis every 3 months, giving customers...
And that seems to be the right drumbeat now. Too many changes can cause a disruption in the business.
Sure, and our goal, of course, just to be forthright, is to make sure that they don't see any big disruptions when they go from one release to the next or an upgrade.
Right.
Our goal is to make sure what they was working, continues to work, and they have new added features for their disposal.
So one of the big things you said is a big change from having an on-premise installation as a product to more of a service as a cloud. What other big changes have you seen?
Well, I think just probably from the adding of different pieces of functionality, right? So we had a very core demand, supply, scheduling and order promising. That was kind of our core, and transportation, which really we consider supply chain execution, so I'll leave it out of this discussion. But we had those 4 core. Now we've added, a purpose-built S&OP process, as I talked about, which is very well received and adopted from an IBP perspective. And then the other piece of the puzzle is the control tower perspective, which provides an analytical end-to-end visibility for supply chain planning. We even take some data from S4HANA or core ERP for those customers. We can even take some data from our supply chain execution friends, meaning transportation or warehousing, and we can get that end-to-end visibility look. So we've added those 2 pieces to the puzzle as well.
So when you say end-to-end, are you talking end-to-end SKU from original sourcing to final consumption or selling along the timeline?
Exactly. So it could be all the way from supplier, raw material, to consumer, bought it off the shelf.
Now, does IBP also have a component that does, not demand sensing, but a little proactive or predictive analytics? Is that part of that, or is that a separate functionality?
We do have a tool that's specifically for predictive analytics, although as part of Control Tower, we do have both historical rear-facing analytics as well as future-looking KPIs and analysis too.
Okay. In implementations now, what do you see as the challenges for when a company wants to implement an ERP? And let's say the worst case, they're going from Excel to something else, which I imagine is rarer these days. Probably is it more of they have an existing SAP older version and they upgrade? What are the challenges for each of those situations? Brand new, greenfield, versus they have a version from 1998?
Good question. So it's really 2 different answers. I'll focus on your question about ERP versus supply chain planning.
Okay.
So ERP, you're right. Mostly they had either a competitor solution, an older version of ours, or maybe a homegrown or a hodgepodge. Some of these customers, our bigger customers, have purchased other things and they want to kind of bring it in together as one and unify that. So that is one big challenge, is unifying those different systems. We always hear, well, we've got this warehousing thing at this one location that we have to have because of well, what's wrong with our WM module? Can't you use that? So a challenge is always trying to wean people off of their ones and understanding whether it really truly is a necessity and a real need, or whether they're just trying to be difficult because they like what they have. Right. That's number one. And I'd say probably the other biggest challenge is data, right? Data is vastly important for any implementation of anything. We had a saying, garbage in, garbage out, can be used in many different cases. We use it in the software industry all the time. You got to have your data set. So that means in my world of production planning, your bill of materials, your routings, your rates, all that stuff. And for an accounting, you need to have your financials and your ledgers and your balance sheets and all the accounting objects and principles set. Otherwise, it's going to be just crumbling.
It seems like a lot of that data, it's getting better, and there's still pockets of things. The one piece of data I've always seen that's just horrible is the master SKU file. that's supposed to provide all the data about each SKU, dimensions, all that stuff, that everything relies upon. I've never seen a company where it's really you trust it. Usually get something wacky in there.
There's some challenges, and I've seen a lot of customers use that, material master, as we call it inside of ERP, as an entity by which to do other things. They might use some fields for not their intended purposes,
Right.
and it becomes, well, that field really is supposed to do this, but we use it for this reason. And this is where we start to get into some kind of best practices as part of the implementation.
Sure.
So I guess I'll finish answering that question as of the challenges is we try to address those challenges with a lot of best practices, right? So a lot of times customers have business processes, and we challenge them in terms of, well, why do you need to do it that way? In SAP structure, we do it these 3 steps.
Okay.
Do you need to do step 4, or do you need to do step 1A and B2? Maybe not. So let's figure out why you're doing that, and we can streamline some of those business processes.
That makes sense. Now, in the early days, in the 90s and early 2000s, SAP was sometimes seen as not overly intuitive for the UI and was somewhat rigid. How has that changed over time?
Yeah, so I would...
Have the colors gotten prettier?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. Back in the day, we were not known for our UI and our usability. So we've done a lot of work on that, right? So we have something now called Fiori. If you go out and look at 2 things from SAP, you probably hear a lot of, which is HANA, which is S4 HANA.
Which is the core.
The core, the digital core, and the technology, and
Right.
the coding, and the analytics aspect of it. It's kind of 3-phased. And then we also have the Fiori aspect. And Fiori is an application. We call them tiles or apps. And they are, it kind of reminds you of an app on a phone. So a planner can go in and say, I want an app. I'll give you an example. In my space, we have one that's for projected inventory. And we have a couple other ones for master data. And we have another one for order rescheduling. So show me all my orders. So a user can create their launch pad and put those apps on there.
Oh,
so the course of their day doing their job, they can use those apps, they click on it, it takes them to that specific function.
So they can customize kind of their dashboard.
Exactly. It's kind of like, again, I hate to keep using this analogy, but it's kind of like your phone, your dashboard, your launch pad will have those different tiles on there, and you can categorize them. You could even say, if you're responsible for different business units or different regions, you could even have them set up separately so that when you go into one, you're only seeing your data. I'm only responsible for South America. I don't want to see North America data, Canada. Right?
And you could actually control it if you didn't want to give them access to it.
Exactly. There's an authorization perspective, so you could say they don't see it at all, or they're able to see it but not change it. But then a planner might pull up a material that's a global material and see it for everything. We could make it such that it's refined, that we could make it specific just so they only see it for the regions that they're used to.
Now, I know every implementation is different, every company is unique, but can you give us a range of what you think the implementation time is? When you started, say, in the late 90s versus now, has it gotten shorter? Has it gotten longer because of the added functionality of things? How is that
From the ERP
changed?
perspective or supply chain planning?
Start with ERP.
Start with ERP. All right, well, I used this line earlier, and I'll use it again. I'll put on my consulting hat. It depends, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it always does depend.
Sure.
It depends on the breadth of the company. We work with Fortune 100 companies that it could take years to roll something out from start to finish.
What's your fastest?
Our fastest from an ERP perspective that I've personally been involved with, I'd say was about under a year, maybe 9 or 10 months.
9 or 10 months.
But again, it's a focused, focused scope, meaning we did production planning, we did materials management, we did some accounting and inventory. We didn't do any of the warehousing piece, we didn't do distribution, no HR, just the core essence of supply chain.
But if the time it takes to implement is 100%, is most of that with the S4 HANA, the core, and then the modules take that time? Because once you have that data in, you kind of establish some processes and things.
I would agree with that, yeah. So when we talk about a supply chain planning solution or a warehouse solution that sits on top of the core, you're utilizing a lot of that data that you've already set up, so it should come up correctly. It doesn't mean that you have to just accept it for what it is. It's always important to make sure that it's right and in the format that you need for the planning tool. But that typically, you're right, the implementation time should be shorter than the core ERP systems.
So most of our students will not work for SAP. They will probably work for companies that might consider certainly use an ERP and different planning modules. What advice would you give them if they're out there trying to implement or decide upon an ERP solution?
First thing, don't call it SAP. I had several students come up to me today and say, well, we're looking into SAP. I haven't heard SAP called SAP in a long, long time. There used to be some jokes that if you're new to SAP, we call you saplings.
Oh, that's
all right. So that's the first thing that kind of shows that you don't really know what you're talking about. We call ourselves SAP.
Okay.
That's the first thing. So, but what's important is to know that SAP has a full, robust solution, end to end, and we've even done some acquisitions. I mean, we used to think, and I still am even guilty of this, of thinking of our core ERP from year 2000 as what SAP is. But we've bought companies like Fieldglass, Concur. We have a wonderful travel management system now that I actually have to use as a user inside of SAP, and it's on my phone now. And I can enter expenses when I go out to dinner later. I'll take a picture of the receipt and hit attach, and it will be in my expense report. So understand that SAP has kind of evolved. We're not just this stodgy old ERP.
That's a change, because it used to be not built here.
Exactly.
In German.
That is correct.
Had to be coded here, but I forgot that you guys acquired SmartOps.
We did. Yes, that's exactly right. So we've had a lot of acquisitions, and even success factors from HR, but as you mentioned, SmartOps was a big acquisition for us in the supply chain planning space.
Right.
They were a best-of-breed vendor for inventory management and inventory optimization. Their product was called Enterprise Inventory Optimization. We love our acronyms, so EIO.
Of course.
And then we have brought them into the fold, and that is the inventory component of IBP.
And that's really interesting, because that is a marked change that I think over the last 15, 20 years in software. There used to be the ERP version, which was generic, or best of breed. And it seems like it was always, do you want to do the ERP and it can do stuff okay, or do you want this best of breed that does it, deeper?
Really fancy.
And it seems like they're merging, because the best of breeds are disappearing, they're getting acquired, and it's becoming more of a offered solution.
I would agree. I think it's a fair statement. Over the last 20 years, we've seen some movement in that direction.
Big change.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any last words you want to give our students? There's usually from 190 different countries, about 30,000 students watching this now. Any last minute advice you want to give them? Besides not calling it SAP.
Besides not calling it SAP. Well, again, I like to say that SAP has a very broad solution. We're a global company in many countries of the world, if not all of them. I haven't been to all of them, but SAP can take you from start to finish in terms of our solutions, and we're not just a back office accounting ERP system anymore.
You're not just a German software company.
Not just a German software back office, even though we are built on good, hard technology.
All right. Great. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.